All right, we're live. Hey, Louis, how's it going?
Hey, hi, Kalyan. It's so great to be here with you. Away from you, but with you.
Amazing. So yeah, let's actually get going. And keep it super as short as possible. Try and keep it as actionable as possible. We're going to be talking about two things here today. Um, One, we're going to talk about Lewis's background and his journey so far. And two, we want to sort of spend some time talking about alumni community building and specifically some of the work that Louis is planning to do at Almabase. And just by way of background, again, I'm Kalyan, co-founder and CEO at Almabase. And so my story of how Almabase got started goes way back, when I was in college. And there was this particular situation where some of my classmates were being forced to drop out of college, and this is in India, by the way, where like there isn't a formal structure around alumni relations or fundraising or scholarships, etc. So
Mhm.
this was new. And anyway, so back then we were just students. We were just like, this doesn't make sense, right? Like these people worked so hard to get here, and then being forced to drop out is going to be obviously disastrous for their career. So how do we actually solve this problem, right? And we just came up with a very simple idea. What we said is, hey, like, why don't we reach out to like the 30,000 alumni of our college, and figure out if somebody can support these students, right? It was really as simple as that. We ended up
Mhm.
realizing that we were supposed to start a foundation to do that work, etc. We ended up doing that, started a foundation, raised money, funded scholarships, and then several things happened. One thing connected with another, but eventually, we ended up funding like over 200 scholarships over the course of the next few years until the college sort of absorbed the
Took it
foundation,
on.
yeah, into the college. But through that journey, we realized that this mission of raising money to be able to make education more affordable to everyone is very important in our lives, beyond just our own alma mater. And that's how Almabase came together. We started Almabase to be able to serve more communities, right? And today's topic is very exciting for me because communities have always been an important part of my life. I've learned so much from the different communities I've been part of, and I always
Mhm.
try to pay it forward as well. And during COVID, especially over the last couple of years, the need for strong communities, even virtually, took like this whole new level of importance, right? Like, I mean, people have always longed for meaningful connections with each other. The social animals that we are, we always found our strength, in the numbers. And so, to be able to share experiences we have in common or talk about topics where we have a mutual interest, or provide just that sense of belonging and comfort, or even like come up with new ideas or solve problems together, communities play a critical role, right? And like when you're building
Mhm.
communities, to be able to facilitate these connections, it's an incredible experience because you really don't know, like, how we cross each other's paths.
Mhm.
And, talking
Totally.
about actually crossing paths, Louis, I want to talk a little bit before we get into maybe even like talking about how we both crossed paths, right?
Uh-huh.
Can you give our audience, and maybe there's a lot of people in the audience who already know your story, but for those of them that are new, can you give us a little bit of background into like, how you started, where did you go, what happened, what led you to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. Kalyan, can I point out like two really important um, items that jumped out to me in the story you were sharing. And by the way, if anybody has a question as we go, wants more detail about something, or wants to question, react or criticize, whatever, just please share your thoughts, and we'll address them as we go. But what Kalyan was describing was really um, very much the essence of philanthropy. Group of people coming together to solve a social need of some type. And I feel like people say, oh, all this technology, is this something new? Well, in reality, not really. It's almost like going back to the roots.
Yeah.
So then, speaking of the roots, and I'll address your question, Kalyan. My story is, you know how I came to community and to discover this area. Well, I was thinking I was going to be a musician. My parents wanted me to be an economist, so that created a hot mess of a person. So what I discovered, it all came together really was in fundraising and advancement work, development, etc. There's the mission, there's a technical side. If you're into that, there's a people side. And I really thrived there. What I discovered as I went along in my career in the US, 10 plus years working in a variety of higher ed institutions, University of Tennessee, Muhlenberg College, most recently, Johns Hopkins University. What I discovered was that there was kind of a path that was not really very much recognized or established as a very strong career path. And I think lots of the people that are in alumni relations or annual giving here with us may be able to relate to that. It's, if you're not going to be that major gift fundraiser, road warrior model, which is extremely valuable and necessary, I was always trying to figure my way, what the right career choices were. And I kind of discovered that there was this space to build communities that created really good fundraising outcomes. And Kalyan, can I share a story about one such project?
Yeah, I think I was going to ask actually. I think I wanted to kind of understand, maybe for the sake of the audience as well, what has been your experience either in terms of participating in certain communities that have been really valuable for you, or sort of organizing some of the communities, because we all know some of the work that you've done, but I think for the audience, if you can explain a couple of those stories, that'll be helpful.
Thank you. So I have just an example that's I think illustrates kind of how it all started to come together in my head. So I was at Hopkins, and I was the assigned fundraiser to one of the departments in their School of International Studies. And actually, a board member came up to me. Well, I went to meet with him and kind of ask for advice. And he said, who have you, done a favor? He was being sarcastic to get assigned to this department. It's impossible to fundraise for it. And on top of that, we come up with a project of fundraising for a professor's retirement, which anybody who works in the higher ed space will know that it's complicated, because people say that they want to support, that everybody's going to give, but then it's just hard to get people to act, usually. So my thought was, well, why don't we organize this as the models that already work? So I was thinking of our board. So people that get together regularly around the common purpose, get to weigh into the outcome. And then, some of them are identified as leaders, and you ask for gifts or connections or all those wonderful things that can come out of this type of structure. Think of your reunion committees. Again, a group of people that come together regularly around a shared purpose. And it's exactly the same story you were sharing, Kalyan, right? To do something good in the world. And then some of them will kind of raise their hands and help out even more, right? And that can be in the form of gifts, etc. So we did exactly the same thing. I got a kind of a committee, an advisory group to celebrate this retirement. We were strategic in who we chose to be a part of this smaller group that would invite everybody else. We planned an event with them that had heads of state. It was super high level. And we ended up raising $500,000 in 6 months. So from this kind of program that people were saying, and again, this is a part of what happens with communities is that, it's a group effort. And from the outside, it doesn't look so, how to say it, so hot. No, it's not something you'd put in your portfolio. It's people just sharing ideas and sometimes sharing pictures of their cats, right? But for the people on the inside, it's super powerful. So that was one story.
Yeah. How would you, given all of the work that you've done so far and the experiences that you've been through, what's your definition of a community, or a strong community or a thriving community? How would you look at what are the parameters of a good community?
Yeah. So as part of my onboarding with Almabase, Kalyan, that we've been having very deep discussions about this. I am partial to one that's not mine, but that exists in the literature, that describes communities as when people get together. So people need to actually get together virtually or in real life, right? So our traditional alumni events, that counts as community building, as long as it meets these other characteristics, right? It's purposeful. So sometimes that's what's criticized with galas and things like that. Well, people get together, but they're just buying dinner. Well, that's because it's not purposeful. It's participatory, so you get to have a say. There's a back and forth that applies to a lot of our communications around communities. Think of the traditional kind of maybe lecture series that a university does. Well, that can be done in a way that's participatory or not, right? So if it's just people sitting in a webinar with no opportunity to interact. And speaking of interactions, if there are any questions, please feel free to send them our way as we go. And I see one from Chris. Maybe we can address it in a sec. So it's participatory, it's purposeful, it's recurring. So people need to have a certain rhythm, and some people call it rituals. And kind of there's a space of people that are thinking and writing about community building, and they call it like rituals. You need to have shared rituals, shared traditions. And in higher ed, I would say we have been historically fantastic at that, and maybe lately we've kind of lost that feeling that was something important. And then finally you identify people that are going to help out, maybe by giving or by organizing or in all the advocating, all the wonderful things that they can do.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think one thing that I want to double down on, or just reiterate before we get to Chris's question here, is the word participatory, right? And I know, Louis, you recommended this book that we've all been reading internally now over the last couple of weeks, getting together or get together. And like one of the things they talk about there, which really stood out for me, was like build the difference between building a community for your audience versus building a community with your audience, right? And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of how you actually make it come to life, right? And there's plenty to talk about in terms of the learnings from that book. But let's actually talk about Chris's question here. Louis, I'll let you answer first. What do you recommend for building up a global community? There's a lot on the domestic space, but a little on building up an international alumni base.
Okay, so I would say I would identify two parts to the question, Chris, and I hope it's okay. And if I'm wrong, please correct me. But you're talking about an alumni base, which is the outcome. I would say that to build up an international alumni base, you need to build communities where they can feel that they're a part of. And that I'm going to give you a very similar answer to when people ask, how would you recommend starting to fundraise with crypto and that type of thing? And that's community based too. But so what I would do is, if you have a platform, so people so let's go back to the definition. It's people getting together. They can get together digitally on platforms like Almabase, of course, on other platforms. And you need to design programming or other types of get-togethers. So maybe it's a Zoom call type of thing. There's some. If you want to connect later, Chris, I can connect you with some international schools that do a really good job, where people will want to come to this on a recurring basis. So maybe you have your monthly international alum call, and you feature somebody that's super accomplished every week. Something like that. Or you share challenges of expat challenges, people living abroad, maybe if it's mostly US nationals that have moved. Things like that. You make sure it's participatory, so it's not just webinars and people sitting in on listening on panels. It's purposeful. We already talked about recurring. And then eventually you start identify volunteers in that group, and you maybe set up a task force, a workforce, you do a fundraising campaign, and that's kind of a ball that just keeps growing. So that would be my advice.
I'll just say two things. One, I mean, actually, a couple of weeks ago, we did another LinkedIn Live, which was specifically focused on sort of international alumni relations and some of the experiences that our panelists had. So definitely recommend checking that out, Chris. There's a lot of good points made there, and I won't go into a lot of detail there. But I think one other interesting question that leads off of that was, Louis, when you think about someone who's trying to build a community from scratch, right? Like what's the first step? Like what should they be doing as a first step in terms of like
Mhm.
starting to build a community, whether that is an international community, whether that's a local community, whether that's an affinity based community, whatever the nature and the shape and the form of the community, what is a good first step towards building community?
So that's a really good question. And in fact, we're going through that, Kalyan, internally right now at Almabase. So we're talking a lot about community discovery. And I have to say, I learned, I grew up as a fundraising professional in higher ed, and we have fantastic models in higher ed. So what do? You set up an advisory board or a steering committee type group. So you start small and then you go from the inside and you spread out, some there's another approach that some people try, that it's kind of like just starting to send out mass emails and trying to go from the outside in. And I find that to be much harder and essentially less effective, right? So Kalyan, to answer your question, I would start with a small group. I would pull them. I would do some discovery with them, and I would ask for their help on some type of recurring advisory board, which would start to be the core of that community.
Yeah. And again, going back to that idea of trying to be participatory from step zero, right? Like how do you build for, with the group versus for the group? So that's a good point. Um, Speaking of which, I want to sort of switch gears here and talk about some of the work that you and I are planning to do within Almabase in terms of like creating more work, creating more, content
Mhm.
around building great alumni communities, but also building our own community for Alma-based customers, and then hopefully eventually, even broader than that. Let's go back to the story of how we met, and I'm more curious, about like after the conversation that we had, what drew you to Alma Base? What are you planning to do over the next couple of months within Alma Base? And just walk the audience through how that, so how you made the decision and how that connects to some of the work, some of the things we've been talking about over the last few minutes.
Absolutely. So, obviously we're working together now, but what I'm going to say is really coming from the heart. So I'm saying it because I truly believe in this. Alma Base, and by extension you, and the rest of the leadership team are thinking of the difficult questions and the questions that need answering. So where you might have had a sense, or I might have had a sense, maybe incorrect, that people on the vendor side of things were just thinking of features, trying to convince us to need things that we really didn't need. What I got out of that conversation with you, Kalyan, was that you're really thinking of things that almost nobody is addressing. Really, is how do we get more engaged communities? How do we get that engagement to turn into desirable behaviors, like advocacy, like giving, like volunteerism, um, things like that? And how can we help people through our tools, obviously, which for the last 2 weeks I've been kind of deep in the back end, and it's absolutely gorgeous. If somebody here hasn't like been able to go through a demo, I highly recommend it. But how do you get people through the design of the tool in a very like thoughtful way, get people to end up having those outcomes that you've felt in your experiences, that project that you fundraised for, that you've seen? I know lots of your employees have told me, well, I was involved in a gaming community. Well, I'm involved in a nonprofit that engages, I don't know, 10,000 volunteers across India. So I know that that's kind of an important part of lots of people that are working towards this. So that was kind of my main takeaway, if I have to say. So I felt kind of like, oh my goodness, I called my dad. I found my place in the world. So
Yeah, I felt similarly as well. I mean, given all of the work that you were doing over the last, several months, and obviously I've only gotten to know you over the last several months, but you've all done a ton of important work over the years preceding that as well. But what stood out to me in terms of our conversation and why I felt like, maybe this is a good partnership is you have a very clear understanding of why a community is important and how to drive specific behaviors out of that community in a meaningful way, and the specific concepts that we spoke about in terms of it being recurring, it being participatory, it being purposeful, and things like that. And the challenge that I think the industry has today, right? Specifically talking about alumni relations and broadly the annual fund industry, is most people that take up alumni relations roles come from the background of sort of event organizing, right? Like that's a core skill, along with communications and things like that. And
Mm-hmm.
not a lot of experience when it comes to actual online community building, right? Even though, in terms of the other work that we do in alumni relations, a lot of that is community building, but we don't necessarily look at it that way, right?
Yeah.
And so clearly there was a need for education, like, best practices around how to build community, because again, all of us in alumni relations teams know that we don't have a ton of staff to be able to go spend time and energy in, like, figuring out how to build a community and spend a lot of time doing that, right? And we were getting a lot of that feedback from our customers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what led to our conversation of sort of like, hey, like, is there a way we can come together and sort of figure out a way to educate the entire industry on maybe best practices while we're learning ourselves, right? So we're not going to preach, we're going to actually make it work, right? And then through that, share the lessons as we, go along. And that's the approach, that we're hoping, literally, like, I mean, people call it building in public, right? Like
Yep.
we're going to do this. Hopefully, every week we're going to talk about like what we're learning, what we're seeing, what we're, and hopefully share with the rest of the community.
So, can I pull a thought out of that, which
Go
is
ahead.
one of the benefits of communities is that I don't know how people feel on this call, but have you ever gone through those trainings where, the wonderful HR training, and you go there and then you have to just sit, for an hour on some really important topic? One of the best ways to learn is through community. So, anything that we also think that we have to, educate in the culture of philanthropy, right? That's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, which, we believe that community is also the best way to do that. So you need to get people engaged in the process. They need to see others that are not just maybe like the authority figures, wrestling with it, discuss it. So, there's lots of benefits, and maybe we can talk about that some other time, but education and kind of transformation is one of them.
Yeah, that's a great point. And anybody who's in the audience today, who's watching this live, I'd love for you all to share, any sort of community building activities that you've either tried or participated in. Um, I've been told we also have, we'll pick the best ideas that people share on the comments today and send you guys like an Amazon gift card. So that's additional incentive. But yeah, like we really would love to hear, any ideas that any of you have tried in terms of community building. And Louis, I'll actually pass that question to you as well, right?
Yep.
Either through the donor participation project community that you've built or other communities that you've been participating in. What are some of the, maybe like the top 2 or 3 community building ideas that maybe don't seem intuitively like up there for most people, but like maybe quirky, unintuitive ideas that have actually worked really well? Anything top of mind that you can share?
Okay. So anything that meets those criteria for me is a good candidate. Book clubs, right? I love, those have been super successful. And a lot of this, I know lots of schools are doing them, and my colleagues were doing them successfully. Sometimes it's a matter of just focusing on, like, where are we going to put our attention? And what are we going to make sure that's coordinated and is, integrated with everything else? So book clubs. Like, another thing I'm discovering recently, Kalyan, is gaming, video games. Participatory, purpose. It can be purposeful if, like, you put some purpose in it. Recurring, it identifies leaders. Some people will go nuts around it, So
Sounds like a lot of
there's lots
fun.
of, yeah, exactly. And I think there's lots of potential there from a community building perspective. I don't know what others maybe have thought of, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think those are some of the few. Just okay, another really just kind of, sometimes it's not so original, just getting together. We called it a
Yeah.
happy hour at Muhlenberg College. They went really well. The content was crowdsourced, so from the class. Um, you know, now there's a book I think the influencers or the influencers dinner or something like that, and it's this gentleman who just got people together to make dinner, like actually cook dinner together, and he like kept doing it, and eventually it got to be like well known, and he got Nobel Prize winners to make dinner with him, and like really smart people. But the community building activity doesn't have to be rocket science. It was just like cooking dinner with some random people, no? Which is kind of that model in higher ed of those campaign dinners and things like that. So
Yeah, and I think the other point to be made there also is, I think in a lot of higher education and K-12 institutions, we tend to think of these static kind of groups in terms of who we build community for. Like typically we think of like, say, class groups or, hey, everybody who played football for the university or whatever, right? Like, I think those are useful and I think they may be like great places to start. But I think even starting with the outcome in mind and then sort of saying, hey, like who are the people that are most interested in something like this? And like, what would it make? I mean, what would it take for them to come together? Like, what would be meaningful for them, right? Like thinking of like, I mean, I've seen some very unconventional sort of communities come together, even within higher education, to be able to create an impact, right? And yeah, so I think that's something that people should think about.
So I had a staff member who was very involved with the dance marathons. Amazing professional. And you learn into I studied that a little bit, and boy, they dance for 24 hours. It's incredible. So again, another fun community building thing. Lots of comments from the audience.
Yeah, some interesting ones here. Social happy hours, group volunteer events. Wow, ropes course, team ropes, adventure challenge. Nice. Thanks, Joaquin, for those ideas. All right, we're heading towards the end here. I don't want to sort of drag this further, but like I said, this is just one of many conversations that we'll be doing live, where we'll be talking about what we're learning, what we're hoping to do. A lot of the work that me, my team, Louis, like we're all trying to come together to sort of really understand what would it take to build really strong alumni communities in higher education and K-12. Like what's the formula for it? Like even though I mean, I hate to use the word formula because there is no static thing that works for everyone, but I think trying to understand what are the ingredients, that go into like making a successful community is something that we'll be doing very intentionally and very much in public over the next several months. And hopefully, I mean, I'm convinced that this is going to be game changing in terms of how we all understand building alumni communities, because there's a real need at this point to be able to engage with our alumni broadly beyond the things that we've traditionally done, given the nature of the world right now. And so, yeah, I'll sort of end with that. Louis, any other ending thoughts or closing thoughts for you before we wrap up?
Well, just to reiterate how enormously honored and pleased, it's like I found my home in the world with the Almabase team. Number one. Number two, yes, we know, like between the different teams, there's a lot of expertise and knowledge, but this is also a problem that has not really been solved yet. So we need everybody who's here. If you have thoughts, if you have an idea, please do reach out to Kalyan or to me. And we want to involve you and make you part of this process. We're going to do it, and it's going to be great, but we also need your help. So thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, that's a great point there, Louis. Like neither you nor me nor any of the people here have all the answers. So we have to do this together. And I think it's going to be amazing, like, if we all come together to solve this. So please do send us ideas. Please do send us questions. Like anything that comes our way will help us, have more inputs. The other thing that I'll also say is we're also doing a webinar next week on an important topic, especially again where we are right now in the world. We're actually doing a panel discussion around diversity, equity, and inclusion in alumni relations and advancement. And I mean, I have the honor of being joined by Marinda Reynolds at UConn and Shalonda Martin at Pomona, both thought leaders and experts, in this space. So we're going to be having a very interesting conversation around like how do we get started in DEI, how do we measure the impact, how do we use data to inform strategy. Like we're going to dive deep. I think that's like a 45-minute, so longer conversation. We'll get deep into that. So if any of you are interested, we'll be sharing the link on comments, and feel free to sign up for that as well. All right, great. I think we've done really well on time today, Louis. That's a first for me. We tend to keep going over. So thank you for all of your amazing inputs as always. And let's keep this going.
And I look forward to seeing all of you at the DEI session. It's going to be great. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. Take care.